את הפאנל הבא אנחנו רוצים להקדיש לסוגיה האיראנית, להיערכות בזירה הזו. אנחנו נרצה להרחיב בסוגיה עם סימה שיין, חוקרת בכירה וראש תוכנית איראן במכון למחקרי ביטחון לאומי, שגם תוביל את הפאנל הקרוב. The next panel will be moderated by Sima Shine. She is a senior researcher and director of the Iran program at the INSS, and our honorable speakers will include Lieutenant General Alexus J. Grynkewich, commander of the 9th Air Force, and the Combined Forces Air Component Commander for the U.S. Central Command, Ambassador Neil Wigan, he is the UK Ambassador to the State of Israel, Andrei Kozyrev, he is the former Foreign Minister of Russia, who speaks earlier, and Major General retired Yaakov Amidror, he is the former head of Israel's NSC. I would like to call all of you to the stage and to tell us your remarks. Thank you, Sima. Thank you, all of you.
Yeah, I should use it. Thank you very much. Let's start. I want to start by saying, first of all, to all our audience that this is a simulation. It's a panel, but it is a simulation according a scenario that all the panelists are aware of. With us, Gili has said, but let me say also a word. We have the American representative, Lieutenant General Alexei Grynkewich. I said it before better. We have the British ambassador, Neil, who is a very distinguished friend of the INSS as well. We have Andrei Kozyrev, the former foreign minister of Russia, and my good old friend, Major General Amidror, who was in the last position was, he had done a lot, but his last position was the national security advisor to the prime minister. Okay, first of all, what a great panel do I have. Let's start. We have breaking news coming from the INSS studio.
שלום לכם מאולפן המכון למחקרי ביטחון לאומי. אנחנו עם מבזק מיוחד בעקבות מתקפה על ישראל באמצעות כלי טיס בלתי מאוישים ששוגרו אחר הצהריים מתימן, מעיראק ומלבנון לעבר כמה מטרות ביטחוניות. בסיס חיל הים באילת, הקריה למחקר גרעיני בדימונה ומפעל ביטחוני רגיש במפרץ חיפה. 3 חיילים נהרגו במתקפה על אילת, 4 אזרחים נפצעו באורח בינוני בחיפה. רוב הכטב"מים שחדרו לישראל יורטו על ידי צה"ל. וזו כפי הנראה ההסלמה החמורה ביותר שראינו עד כה במערכה שבין המלחמות בין ישראל לאיראן. ברקע, התקיפה המשולבת שיוחסה לישראל בדרום איראן בתחילת השבוע בשני אתרים שבהם הוחסנו כלי טיס בלתי מאוישים, מהסוג שאיראן מוכרת לרוסיה ושימש גם לתקיפת ספינות ישראליות. וכן תקיפה נוספת בדמשק נגד משלוחי נשק מטהרן לסוריה ולחיזבאללה. המשטר האיראני הודע כי 12 קצינים שלו נהרגו בתקיפה בדמשק ואיים בנקמה כואבת, והיום, כפי הנראה, מימש את איומיו במתקפה הקטלנית. במקביל, מסוריה מגיעים דיווחים על כך שמיליציות פרו-איראניות תקפו היום ברקטות את הכוח האמריקאי השוהה בטנף. אזרח אמריקאי נפצע שם. והערב מזהיר מפקד משמרות המהפכה את ישראל, אם תגיבי, איראן כבר מוכנה עם צעדי המשך ואף ערוכה למערכה ממושכת.
Okay, in case that you don't remember what was on the scenario and it was in Hebrew, I just remind us that we had UAVs coming from Lebanon, Iraq, and Yemen. We have on Eilat, we have 3 killed soldiers, and in other places, which was in the Negev, directed to Dimona, but didn't attack, of course, and Haifa, no casualties, only damage to different sites. And there is one attack on Tanef in Syria, with no killed, but 1 injured soldier. So my question to all of you, let's start with that. I would like you to analyze this scenario according to 3 questions. One is, what each of you understand that happened? We know the facts, what happened, but what does it mean, what happened? That's one thing. What are your considerations, I would say, risk and chances that you would consider before taking any advise any recommendation to your own government and to Israel. And the last will be summarizing that and saying what is your recommendation. So let's start, please, with you, General, the American position. How do you see the issue and the event, and how do you see the recommendations that the US would take?
Great. Well, first off, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here, and I appreciate the invitation to be back in Israel and to join you at INSS for the first time that I've participated in this. So I think there's a few things that the United States, particularly from a military perspective, would be thinking about at this time. The first would be, we of course would be reminded of our ironclad commitment to the defense of Israel. That is a clear US policy stated objective. And so we would be thinking through what is the best way to fulfill that commitment. And there might be a number of ways at the political level that they would be thinking about that. And from a military perspective, we would be offering our recommendations on ways to provide the defense of Israel that would allow for us to manage the potential escalation of the situation. So when I look at this situation, there's a few factors that pertain. The first would be it is a major attack that happened. There was also, I think, included in the scenario an explosion in Iran at a UAV factory. So there's not just an Israeli dimension to this of the attack on Israel and the casualties that happened. There is a connection now to Iran itself. And because there's a connection to Iran and UAVs, there's also a connection to Russia. So there's a couple of pieces of escalation that we would be thinking about managing. One would be with Iran, and of course one would be in the context of the war of Ukraine, which previous panel discussed extensively. The last, and probably the thing that would get the United States' attention domestically, and certainly would be one of my main concerns as a commander in the field, would be the injuries at At-Tamf garrison and how we would protect our forces that were there. What would be the signals and messages that we would be wanting to send either through kinetic or non-kinetic action or through our statements and whatnot. So a lot of dynamics in this very complex scenario. My initial recommendation and where I would be thinking is to try to really figure out what happened. There is a fair amount of ambiguity as to who is responsible. The attacks came from groups that we know are proxies to Iran. We would be looking to try to establish to what extent did those proxy groups or partner groups do this on their own? To what extent did they act with Iranian guidance and direction and support? And we would be looking to see to what the Russian response was as well, given the Russian connection. So my initial recommendation in the military channels would be to pause, let our intelligence teams do some work, develop the scenario a bit more before we jumped immediately into any kind of military action.
Thank you very much. Neil, how Britain and how do you think Europe, if it's different, sees this event, and what would you recommend to your government as well as to Israel?
Thanks very much. So first, I'll take the easy option and agree with the general. It's always good to go straight after a general. I can say I agree with him, and then I sound smart. So I'll take advantage of that. So firstly, clearly this would be a very deliberate escalation by Iran, not only in the attacks on Israel, which I'll talk about, but also in the way it would be talking openly about the attacks on Iran itself, which would be a different approach. So this is a different strategic approach by Iran, and therefore a different nature of conflict. And secondly, the nature of the attacks described on Israel are completely different from what we've seen before, both in the severity of the targets, including the strategic target, in them being launched from multiple locations, and the fact that they managed to get through would worry us for the security of Israel. So I think we would be looking at five problems, 5 risks. The first is to, as General said, to Israel as a key partner of us and what could happen inside Israel. That would be very high on our, and I'm sure other European capitals' concerns. Secondly, the strategic risk of a direct Israel-Iran conflict. Thirdly, the risk of that spreading out into regional countries, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, and possibly an impact into the occupied territories as well. Fourth, the fact that a US service people were involved. So again, some of our allies would also be drawn into this. So how do we position ourselves around that? And then finally, the risk that this directly affects UK interests, whether that's our military personnel serving in the region, our nationals in countries like the UAE where we have large populations, or British ships, other assets, airplanes and other assets which are in the region, and then global economic impact. So if you start to see the oil price escalate, this is a key pressure point for us around the Straits of Hormuz particularly. This would raise our concern very quickly. In terms of recommendations, so I led our emergency unit working on the 2006 Lebanon-Israel war, and this playbook I think would be quite similar to what we saw there. So our first priority would be around our national interests and our nationals. So we would immediately be looking at where are our armed forces in the region, where are our ships in the region, and where are our civilian populations, and what advice and measures should we be giving them in order to protect ourselves. That's going to be the most immediate thing that we will be thinking about. Secondly, reaching out to allies and partners, particularly Israel and the US, as those directly affected, to see what we could do. Thirdly, looking at what international fora, whether it's a UN Security Council, whether it's more informal mechanisms that we can use to try to calm and de-escalate the situation in the way that the General talked about. And then fourthly, I think working out how we can turn this, are there any opportunities from this? So can we use this both to constrain Iran's negative influence in the region through some more durable understanding, or through our partnerships with Gulf countries and others in areas like air defense, where we've seen some discussion around regional security architecture already. Is there something we can do to build something more lasting after this crisis to prevent a repetition? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me put for both of you one short question, because we don't have a lot of time, as you know. Would you, both the US and Britain, separately or together, would you try to bring forces to do something that is that can be seen by Iran as a step in order to prevent Iran from continuing?
Well, I'll take the easy answer and say it depends. I think there would be a lot of discussions about this. There would clearly be bilateral discussions with the United States and Israel. There would be a number of other countries, I think, in the region that would be equally concerned of this as well. And so some of the countries, obviously in the Abraham Accords and other regional players who have equal concerns about Iran, who some of in the history with many of these groups, I think back to 2019 and a very similar kind of attack on the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, so that it echoes regionally as well. So I think there would be a lot of competing asks of the United States, would be my assessment. The United States would have to balance those asks against other global priorities, and whether we float forces in or not would probably depend on our ability to manage the escalation. In some cases, bringing forces in might allow us to de-escalate as a show of force, but that would be entirely dependent on kind of the overall context and how it evolved. So I think there's a lot to unpack there. The one other thing that I would just like to pile on, as the ambassador mentioned, there are a lot of opportunities with regional air defense in the area, and that is one of the tasks that I think President Biden has given to the U.S. military, and as that trickled down, it landed squarely on Air Force's Central's shoulders to try to drive some regional integration and cooperation in terms of intelligence sharing and stitching together combined air defense capabilities. We would certainly be activating that network. We would, I think many of the countries, because they would share the concerns that Israel would have, would likely want to share intelligence, want to share information about potential follow-on attacks if those were a player.
Thank you.
So first, I mean, partly because I'm a diplomat, so I would reach to the diplomatic toolkit probably before the military one. So I talked about international de-escalation mechanisms. I think that would be our first instinct. Second would be around force protection, looking after the security of our own forces. I think strategically, yeah, our objective will be to avoid this escalating even further. So any military response, we would need to be sort of consistent with that objective. We would absolutely understand Israel's right to self-defense, and we would understand the need to ensure that sort of hostile actors didn't interpret this as weakness, that deterrence was maintained. But I think, sort of again to copy the general, I think we would need to work out very tactically exactly how that is best achieved.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Kozyrev, Russia can see it as an attack on Iran, but it was also it started with an attack, supposedly Israeli attack on two sites in Iran. It's two sites that are relevant to the UAV plants and place of garage. And the question is whether Russia sees it in the context of Russia-Iran, Russia-Israel, or Russia-the US. And what do you think will be the attitude of Russia in this event?
Well, first of all, I would say that I'm very happy that I had two previous speakers, because General set the stage exactly correctly, that I would wait for them, and of course Israeli military, to find out more about the situation, and I would wait. When I was foreign minister, I would rely on American intelligence, though they would not probably share with us, but I would still rely on their reaction, because Russian military were not, even at that time, when I was foreign minister, were not, unfortunately, reliable in the sense that they probably knew a lot, because they had and still probably have connections on the ground with, especially with the bad guys. You know, from the Soviet time, they come like KGB and all that, and Putin today is himself from the KGB. So they have a lot of connections, and they have a lot of knowledge, which probably neither the United States nor Great Britain have on the other side. I mean, but exactly for that reason, their reports are and were not reliable, because they are biased. I once tried to have a report from our military and intelligence, I mean in Russia, early 90s, about Iranian moves and about Saddam Hussein's moves, especially when he tried next time to attack or gathered forces there. And they said that there is no forces, Saddam Hussein's forces on the border, when it was even, you know, photos in the international press. Then there were, and Saddam, when I received their report that there is no movement of the Iraqi forces from our military, who definitely knew everything, even probably every tank which was engaged. But few minutes after that, ironically, Saddam spoke publicly and said, yes, we are having a maneuvers there. So I would rely on American reaction. And that leaves me from a necessity to go into the details of the conflict now, because if General does not know and wants more details, then I would definitely want more details too. And Ambassador, I wish I had all my ambassadors when I was foreign minister like that one, because he actually described everything which would come to my mind as a diplomat, what should be done, how it should be done, and all that. One more point which I want to add to the discussion, that my also suspicion would be not only Iran, Hezbollah, and all these usual suspects, but I have a nightmarish scenario. I had it when I was foreign minister, and I still keep having it in my mind, that the area, the region, is so much tense. There is so many players, and not only usual suspects. I always expect a provocation made by the third party, neither by Iran, nor by but some unknown party, and there are other players. I hate to say that some of countries, I don't want to name the countries, but some of those countries seem not to be able to control, or even some of them allow to operate a militia, an uncontrolled extremist, religious extremists. After all, the 9/11 Terrorist Act against the United States was committed by a great number of Saudi citizens. Does not mean that it's government action, but still, I mean, that's an illustration, and there are many other illustrations of this third party, the irresponsible parties, or extremist groups which want to jumpstart a conflict. They want to provoke everybody, especially, of course, Israel and the United States and others, and maybe even Iran, because in this scenario, Iran was also target of attack. So that's what is very important, and that's why it is very important that American military and I hope Israeli military will keep cool, finding out as much as possible where the situation comes from, and not to jump into a confrontation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. If I can summarize, if there is something that is connecting you, is that all the three of you would prefer to see the situation calm and start by studying the situation. So let's go to the Israeli side.
First of all, we will try to understand what happened here. And with all due respect to conspiracies, when the attack is coming from both Lebanon, Iraq, and the Houthis, the answer is very clear. It's not conspiracy by a third element. It's an Iranian operation. And probably in this stage, we will have enough intelligence to show it. It will not be enough for the Americans. One of my friends was the head of the intelligence, said, I'll find a smoking gun, and I told him, you will find a gun. If it's smoking or not, someone in Washington decide. We never bring the Americans to see the smoking of the gun. And the picture is very clear. The Iranians try to change the equation to make another rules of engagement between us and Iran, saying, guys, we are going to have a Lebanese situation. Why Israel didn't attack in the last, few years in Lebanon? Because of deterrence. The Iranians succeeded to build enough deterrence by Hezbollah that Israel is not ready to take the risk. And now we are, the Iranians, are taking the measures which are needed to build this deterrence vis-a-vis Israel and Iran. And now, in Israel, we have to make a decision. Are we ready to give up the ability to act in Iran? Because according to all the information that we have, what the Iranians are trying to do is to say, if you attack in Iran, we will take in Dimona. Do we ready to take this situation as part of our continuous considerations against vis-a-vis the Iranians? This is the question from the Israeli point of view. And it was well understood, the Americans will not do anything, the Europeans will not do anything, and for sure the Russians will not do anything. And we will have to decide if we are doing it by ourselves, because we were the only one who probably have the ability and determination to do something if we decide that we want to do it. One thing is very clear. We don't ask the Americans to come to save us. We never did, and we don't want in the future Israel defend itself by itself. We understand that we cannot act in Iraq because there are American forces there, and we don't want to put more risks on the Americans more than they are facing in Tanef. And as you understand, Tanef also was bombed by the Iranians, the Iranians militias. It's clear for the Americans who did it. I mean, it's not a big story, but it's easier to say we don't know. The question is, okay, do we do something, or we will let the Iranians to build the new equation? Here is the answer. If I would be there, my recommendation would be, we cannot let the Iranians to build a new equation. And we have to react. And to react very precise in an area which is important for the Iranians, not in Iran. Because nothing came from Iran. It came from Iraq, from Lebanon, and from the Houthis. Not from Syria and not from Iran. This is why we should not act in Syria and we should not act in Iran. We have to pick something which is very important for Hezbollah, and for years we want to eliminate it. I don't know if there is something like that. If there is something like that, this is an operation that I would recommend to do as early as possible, to be very precise, one important target, but only one, and to show we are not accepting the new rules that the Iranians want to force on us. We will not be ready to play this game in which we cannot do anything in Iran as we are not doing in Lebanon. And Lebanon is a good place to begin with.
Thank you, Amidror. So let's summarize this round. We are in a situation where Israel understood that Iran has tried, let's put it like that, has tried to change the equation. Israel understands that it doesn't want to retaliate directly on Iran, and therefore the recommendation is to retaliate on an important target. Probably you are hinting for precise missiles or something like that, if we know the information.
I don't have clue idea about the intelligence that now we have on Lebanon, so I don't have any specific target.
We hope we have it.
We hope
Okay.
we have it, yes.
Okay.
No,
Okay.
I trust the guys that I teach for so many years. And they learn something.
Well, it's a new generation now. And the decision on the side of Israel is to attack in Lebanon. It's also changing the equation, because until now, as Amidror said, we tried not to do it. So very short, 2 minutes to each of you, very short. What is the response? Israel has attacked in Lebanon. What is the response of each of you? And we'll continue, please.
Yeah, so as others have said, the United States will always recognize the right of Israel to defend itself, and that includes a lot of actions that we've seen Israel take over the years that have been in response to things like this, maybe not on the scale that we're talking about. So I think from a military perspective, what we would be concerned about is what is the next move. So while there's an immediate response to prevent as you said, sir, the setting of the new equation, I think on the military side, I would be trying to go 2 or 3 moves ahead from this and go, if there's a cycle of escalation, what are the implications for U.S. forces in the region? Will we be subject to attack? Will we somehow be seen as complicit with Israel? Those sorts of things would be going through. So at this point, if we move forward in the scenario and there is that kind of response, I would be looking at, do I have the adequate forces in the region to protect ourselves? Do I have adequate forces in the region to deter an attack against U.S. forces and potentially, of course, to deter any further escalation against Israel? Those would be the sorts of things that we would be thinking through.
Thank you. Neil.
Thanks. So can you hear? So first we would, so as General said, we understand Israel's right to defend itself, but we would apply the usual standards around proportionality and so on. I think secondly, we would be really concerned about the risk of civilian casualties. And again, I talked about the 2006 war, where again, we understood Israel's right to defend itself, but we were deeply worried about the civilian casualties. And linked to that, the effect on Lebanon, which, as you know, is already in an exceptionally fragile state. So I think we would want to understand how this was going to game out, what the expected response would be, and how we could prevent that getting into escalation, what the mechanisms could be to try to draw a line at a particular point on this, but establish new rules of the game, both diplomatically and militarily. And then, as I said, our focus would shift very quickly to our national interests. So I worked on the evacuation of our nationals from Lebanon in 2006. We'd be looking at that. We'd be looking at the safety of British nationals in Israel. So our national interests would start to escalate very quickly in that scenario.
Since I understand that both of you are worried with your national security, which is of course understood, I just want to ask you with yes and no, very short, would you come out with any declaration to stop it, or something to prevent Iran from continuing, or prevent Hezbollah from continuing, something that will relate to the next stage? Very shortly.
Yeah, that's a hard question for me to answer because that would be a political decision.
That's right.
So
That's right.
Unlike in the IDF, they are not involved.
Exactly.
That's right. So, I don't know what would be said at the political level. What I can say is in military communications, we would be talking about our right to self-defense. We would be talking about the need to maintain order, the need to de-escalate. So there would be a lot of things we might be saying in the military dimension, but we'd nuance that to stay out of the political level discussions.
So yeah, our objective would be to try to draw a line at a particular point, and that would be messaging to both sides, both to Iran not to escalate, to its proxies not to escalate, but also with Israel trying to understand its strategy for preventing that escalation.
Okay. Please.
If it would be established fact that it was Iranian action and Iranian provocation, I admire this approach of the American and the British that they will calculate many steps ahead and forces on the ground, which I respect, and the foreign policy approach like de-escalation or whatever, avoiding escalation. But with clients like Iran and Russia, that might not work. Both Iran and Russia, and I also invoke here the Ukrainian situation today. They perfectly aware of the military superiority of the United States and Great Britain and the NATO, and military ability of Israel to act, but they respect only action. And that's where I agree with the general. It's up to generals to find and to define what kind of response. But there should be, as soon as possible, as soon as you have an idea, more clear idea, what is behind that it is not a provocation to provoke everyone. Then, if it is Iran, there should be a military action. I am speaking as a professional diplomat now. Not diplomatic declarations, no warnings, no red lines. You know, they don't respect red lines. And if they overstep the red line, because this attack, if it is Iranian attack, it would be overstepping red lines. So there should be military response, hopefully with the help of the United States air power, and they will respect it. And that will be the red line for them.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, I don't have to summarize, everybody understands what happened here. We have a short, I remind you, we are in a simulation, we have short breakout news.
שוב שלום לכם מאולפן המכון למחקרי ביטחון לאומי. אנחנו עם עדכון מיוחד נוסף בעקבות ההסלמה במערכה בין ישראל לאיראן, שהובילה למותם של 3 חיילים בבסיס חיל הים באילת כתוצאה ממתקפת הכטב"מים המיוחסת לאיראן. לפי הדיווחים שמגיעים בשעה האחרונה, רוסיה פנתה לארצות הברית בעקבות ההסלמה האזורית כדי לנהל דיאלוג למניעת הידרדרות נוספת בין בעלות בריתן במזרח התיכון. וזו השאלה שמהדהדת הערב בוושינגטון, במוסקבה, גם בירושלים ובטהרן. האם ארצות הברית ורוסיה יצליחו לעצור את המשך ההסלמה שעלולה להוביל למלחמה אזורית?
Works. In one word, the Russians have approached, according to the news, the Americans and said, let's try and stop the escalation. In brackets, I would say it is a chance for Russia we are in the real time, so during the Ukraine war, to start any kind of a dialogue. I know you are a general, but still you can try and imagine what are the interests of both sides, and is there something to start any kind of negotiations?
So I have a couple of thoughts here. The first would be, well, I've been taught all my life doing military exercises not to fight the scenario, but exercise within the scenario I've been given. I do find it highly improbable that this would play out in the way that it did. If I look at Russian interests are to draw the United States into a conflagration somewhere else outside of Ukraine. Frankly, it would be in the interest of the Chinese for the United States to be distracted in the Middle East. So as a global power, the United States has a very different perspective than you might hear in Israel, as we are trying to balance risk across the globe and think about how we do this over time so that we don't have a situation where we find ourselves with no good options for the next crisis that erupts. So with that being said, getting back to the scenario, I think the United States, if there was an overture to try to de-escalate the situation, we would be open to it because it's not in our interest to be distracted by a conflagration in the Middle East as well. So I think that is where we would be when we approach this.
Thank you. Neil.
Thanks. So as a diplomat, again, our default option is to say any offer of help we should take seriously, and we would take it seriously. But I would almost sort of flip it around and say the situation that we are now in with Ukraine means that Russia's ability to play that constructive role has massively diminished. So whereas 10, 15 years ago, Russia might have that ability, I think the degree of skepticism, the degree of sort of fractured relationships with Russia have really weakened Russia's ability to play that kind of global role.
Okay, even though the Russians do have special relations with Iran, and they could use it in order to make the Americans, perhaps in a way, looking on on the possibilities for dialogue on Ukraine as well.
I think our threshold for trusting Russian mediation efforts would be very high, and I put that as diplomatically as I can.
I want to ask the Israeli side, since it was a Russian suggestion, I don't ask you now. Amidror, how does Israel see it? Is it an opportunity for Israel or something else?
We cannot stop the Russians and the Americans to have a dialogue. If they decide both in Washington and Moscow that they want the dialogue, I don't think that Israel should involve in this decision. If the Americans want, I don't believe that in this situation it will happen, but if that happened, Israel should not be against it. We have to see, more important for us is what are the results of the attack in Lebanon, and if the message was understood in Tehran. And if the message was understood in Tehran, we don't have to repeat another attack. It's okay. We don't have an interest now to take the whole area for another circle of flame. If the Americans decide to speak with the Russian, it's okay. I don't believe, by the way, that the Iranians will be open to any offer from the Russians to do something if they decide that they are not doing it, and vice versa, if they decide not to do something. So I'm very pessimistic about ability to calm the situation by the combination of Washington and Moscow, but if that happens, Israel should not be involved. We have to prepare ourselves for the next reaction of the Iranians, because if that happens, we should be very better prepared and to be with answers and solutions in our hands and to act immediately.
Okay. As you can understand, we don't have the time to try and see what happens really if the Hezbollah is retaliating on or Iran is demanding Hezbollah to stop. So we don't have this time, and I want to go for our last, I'm looking on the watch, and I understand that we have only 8 minutes or 9. I want to ask you, let's leave the simulation now. We are in a real situation as we are today. What do you think could be done today in order to prevent such a scenario? Because this scenario, we didn't continue with it, but it could escalate to a wider conflict, military conflict. Probably it would escalate a little bit, even if it will be stopped after some days. What we did here is a short way of trying to touch the issue. What can be done today in the real time, not in the simulation, in order to prevent such an escalation? Please.
I'll try to be brief. I think what you recognized through the previous discussion is there is a bit of a tension between the Israeli view and the view of other countries in terms of immediate action or taking it a little bit slower. The way to resolve that dilemma is to put Israel in a situation where they're not so isolated in terms of what their response might be. And I think the real opportunity rests on the foundation of the Abraham Accords, in finding other countries that have equal or greater concerns about Iranian behavior based on how it has destabilized the entire region, and building up military to military and eventually political to political level contacts and cooperation. I think that's a real opportunity for Israel and one that I would seize upon any chance I got.
Thank you. So first, I mean, building on that, I think we see the mechanisms that General talked about before in terms of air defense, the CENTCOM-led process as a way. There might be scope there for demonstrating there is a more difficult target to attack and a more united approach. So that is one area. I think secondly, as the minister said, the series of regional weaknesses in countries like Lebanon and countries like Syria, Yemen, Iraq sort of creates the scope in which this scenario is possible. So efforts country by country to try to address the situations there and reduce Iran's malign influence. Clearly that's a very tall order, but I think this scenario shows the urgency of addressing that concretely. And thirdly, I think the sort of for all skepticism about the JCPOA, but some kind of process with Iran which makes it feel it has a stake in acting as a responsible actor rather than advancing its interest as an irresponsible actor.
Neil, do you mean that Iran will have it, actually you open chances for Iran out of this conflict?
So, I mean, I think our objective is for Iran to see its best way of serving its national interest as being through a negotiating table rather than through use of proxies and military action. Again, that is a very tall order, but I think this scenario shows that the consequences of not having that as an alternative to the Iranian regime.
Okay, please, Andrei.
Well, Ambassador put it in the best of diplomatic speak. Since I am not an active diplomat or official now, I can put it in a very brief and very simple words. An aircraft carrier coming close to the area here, somewhere, maybe 2 aircraft carriers would send the message to Iran and Russia. And as to Russian proposal of the peace talks or negotiations, that's illustrated today, the value of that illustrated in Ukraine. They seized a part of Ukrainian territory, they bombard Ukraine, they kill people in Ukraine, and now, as they want a little bit of breathing space to regain power, they propose the ceasefire. So that's the value of their peace proposals.
Amidror, how does Israel feel?
Two remarks about what was offered by the Americans and Great Britain. If the Americans tell us, guys, wait 2 weeks and we will bomb Iran, we will wait. But we understand what is
generous.
What we understand when the Americans are saying, we have to understand, we have to see, we have to decide. At the end of the day, we will be alone and we will have to pick the best time to do it because we will have to do it by ourselves. So we will have to decide when and how we are reacting. About the ambassador suggestion, with all due respect, Mr. Ambassador, when Iran was part of the agreement, they were not less aggressive in the Middle East. There is no any connection between the aggressiveness of the Iranians and the fact that they were part of the P5+1 agreement or not. So I wouldn't take this path and become naive enough to think that if they are going back to the negotiation table, they will be less aggressive. They never had been and probably will not be. About our situation, look, you have to be very, very naive to think that building this huge capability in Lebanon, 100,000 rockets and missiles, and adding all the time more and more sophisticated weapon systems into Lebanon, at the end of the day will not be ended with a war. It was said by some of us many years ago that leave it alone, it will be yes, dust, a rust. No, it will not. It will be used one day. When? It's better for us to pick the day and to decide when we are ready enough and how should it be done, not to let the other side to make the decision. In this case, it is not in the cards. We are not speaking about a war in Lebanon. It might happen. We have to be very well prepared for that. Now we are focusing on one thing, not to let the Iranians to change the equation. And the more that we will succeed to convince the Iranians not to change the equation, and we will have the ability and the flexibility to act whenever is needed to postpone the capabilities of Iran from being in a very dangerous point, the better for Israel.
Thank you, Amidror. We have less than 1 minute, but I was told by the organizers that I can steal 3 other or 2 minutes. So let me just try and summarize where we stand, where Israel is standing. On one hand, Amidror suggested, and I assume he's correct and very close to the Israeli thinking, that Israel cannot allow a new equation. And this event that happened with UAVs from 3 countries reaching Israel puts Israel in a situation where it cannot, even though it was a retaliation on something that Israel has done, it cannot put Israel in a situation where Israel doesn't respond. At the same time, as you said, the Americans and the Brits are trying to understand the situation so that they will not be involved too much. And the Russians probably are so happy that somebody else is fighting somewhere else and not all the focus is on Ukraine. So let's hope that Israel will know how to find the proper time to retaliate in a way that will not escalate to a full-scale war. Thank you very much to all of you. It was a great panel. Thank you.
I'm going to ask to invite to the stage head of the Institute, Mr. Tamir Hayman, General Tamir Hayman. We talked now about a scenario that is a regional scenario. We didn't talk about the Iranian nuclear armaments project, which is, of course, our first priority, and also in recent days, we also should have been our first priority, specifically in the last few days. So I'd like to ask you one question. We've heard recently a very long interview of the head of the CIA, director of the CIA, that in regards to nuclear Iran said, we don't have enough information that Iran has decided to complete its nuclear armaments project. What do you think? Well, you can maybe think about a perspective through intelligence reports and a Western idealistic idea of what intel means. If you don't see a directive from on high, apparently there's no plan. Well, I'd like to use the words that the Chinese colonel, that even though there wasn't there's a organized plan, things still unfold. So this is a more maybe Eastern approach rather than a Western approach, that whether there's a plan or not, things will happen. And we think that if only after we see a directive, then we'll see, meaning somebody on high in the Iranian government says, yes, we need nuclear weapons, and then there'll be nuclear weapons. No, nuclear weapons will happen and is continuing to happen all the time. It's reached an unprecedented point. in every aspect of its development, not only in terms of enrichment, which is the most advanced, where this issue has almost reached full maturity stage, but also in terms of weaponization and in terms of other issues. We see progress. So the so one day the leader will look at this reality and say, "What? The stars align. There's an opportunity. Maybe God is talking to me." And then they'll give the authorization. And I can see the debriefing happening after in the IDF intelligence call, where they look for the intelligence officer that didn't manage to see the order being given. How is it that there's a nuclear weapon in Iran, but nobody gave the order? How did that happen? Well, because according to the Chinese philosophy, which I agree with in this case, things happen whether you order them or not. So people have to be very suspicious about the kind of sense of security that we have, that only after we see an order officially being given, only then will things materialize. No, things materialize regardless. And nevertheless, to calm us down, all of the recent developments that, and maybe I'll ask you about them, are very serious enrichment developments. And enrichment is not a bomb. Even after they complete enrichment, it's going to be a very dangerous situation in terms of our operative possibilities. But enrichment itself is not a bomb. And we, as Westerners, have to look very seriously at the undercurrents that are happening, the motivation that is happening, not from the highest echelons of Iranian government, but rather much lower than that. I mean, we talked about 84% of enrichment, and that was the goal never to meet. Okay, and I recall that maybe there were people who were with me in the simulations at the time. We did a scenario in which we figured out what Iranian does if the United States recedes from the agreement. And they said maybe they'd go to 20% enrichment. And everybody in the simulation hushed the speaker and said, 20%? Impossible. No way. We're at 84. So where are we going? You're right. I think that Israel, if it was in a more normal, let's say, situation, this certainly would be the issue to discuss, but it's not the situation. And no doubt what the International Atomic Agency found in Iran was very close to, it was over 80%, and 90% is a bomb, and certainly there are enough capabilities even as it is. And the question is, how did it happen? Of course, there are many explanations. The Iranians said that they connected the cascades in such a way that it created some advancement. No, they didn't tell the International Atomic Energy Agency that they did so. So they certainly did so behind the scenes. There's an experiment balloon in which the Iranians are saying to the world, we're first of all showing you that we know how to enrich uranium to a high level, but we can do it too. And the Iranians are warning the world that if the world takes any steps against them, that's what they're going to do. And these additional steps can happen next week. Exactly in a week, there's going to be the forum of leaders of the Atomic Agency, and they have to decide about what's happening in Iran. And the result, the normal, so to speak, result should have been transferring the Iranian issue to the Security Committee. And at the moment, all I can hear about is the Iranians are inviting the director of Saba to go to Tehran. They'll probably give him a little tour so that he won't do anything against them. So the Iranians feel that they are on the high horse and they can gallop ahead. So in this regard, what do we do? What does Israel need to do, and what does the international community need to do? Because at the end of the day, the international community is the major player here. True. And the first thing that we need to do is acknowledge the fact that the current strategy will lead us to a dead end. Sometimes before you fix things or repair them, you have to understand that they're broken and say that the continued conduct as we are conducting ourselves right now will only, has a very high probability to lead us to a nuclear Iran, an arms race in the Middle East, into a restriction of Israeli activities, then increase of deterrent power. It may sound circumstantial, but that's actually the key point, to acknowledge that the current system is broken. And now you have several options. And I did hear, if I heard correctly, what from the German foreign counselor yesterday about the need to return the full sanctions on Iran. But what she's actually saying, she's saying that the sanctions of the security community, meaning, are such that Germany recommends, and this is right, to break the current agreement, because had we joined it, not us, if it had been signed a year ago, we'd been in a better situation. But there's no point in, crying over spilt milk. So in the current reality right now, we can't, allow this limbo situation to continue. First of all, get it off the table completely as soon as one of the European partners do that. And there's sanctions of the Security Council in a very aggressive way. Iran is very concerned about that. On the other hand, the attack capabilities through international collaboration that really will deter Iran and stop them from continuing to expand their project as they're doing thus far. We have 2 more minutes, maybe 2 minutes 30 seconds, so let me ask you one more question. First of all, what you're saying is that it's time basically for the international system to declare officially that there's no more dialogue, that there is no agreement anymore. I mean, we are sure that the agreement is over anyway, but officially make it over. And what's happened with the United States thus far is the Americans say there's no negotiations, we're not going to talk to the Iranians. But each one of the American speakers, from the lowest to the highest seniority, say the option for even heard from the British today, the option will come back to the negotiation table. They still say that. And what I understand from you, and I believe that you believe that it should be Israeli policy, is let's take the mask off, let's speak candidly, and let's say openly, there is no agreement. Iran has violated every single article. Let's go back to sanctions. Now, are you concerned that Iran decides that if this happens, they will decide to leave the NBT and to get out the supervisors and inspectors that are in its premises and throw them out? Yeah, maybe we need a wake-up call. Maybe we do. Because just like, the cooking frog, that metaphor, the story about the frog and sitting in water and the water slowly heats up. I mean, 2 years ago we would have rushed to action. But the water is slowly heating. It's gradual. It's incremental. You don't feel it as you boil alive. And we didn't lead. The 30% and 40% led to 84% enrichment. So yeah, that's the risk. But I ask everybody in this issue who knows about it, what's the difference between 60% enrichment to 84 to 90? Aren't we just fooling ourselves? Because anybody who knows about enrichment of uranium, that if once you've gone over the 20% mark, between 20 to 60 to 90 is just a question of time. So the fact that we are currently 12 days away, 12 days from 90%, is that a reason to now relax and not do anything? So maybe it's a bit disruptive what I'm saying, but yes, the Iranians will do something, and what they do will require us to do something, and that action is better than no action. And just in 2 seconds, let me say, we are summarizing the panel, which in my opinion deals with the most significant threat on the state of Israel strategically, and that is Iran. It's not just drones, it's not just nuclear power, it's also terrorism. Iran is also an entity that has its influence and branches throughout the region. And we should focus the attention of Israel on these current times on Iran. And instead of focusing our attention on that, we're dealing with other things that are distracting us. Thank you very much. I certainly agree with you.